She traveled 2,000 miles to find love. She found a monster instead. In the winter of 1887, the Montana Territory was a place of long shadows and longer memories. The land stretched out in rolling waves of brown and white, snow clinging to the low hills, wind moving across the plains like a living thing. Towns were little more than clusters of false front buildings, their lights flickering weakly against a night that seemed to go on forever. This is where Martha Callahan's story ends. But it begins a world away, in the choking, crowded streets of Boston. Martha was 24 years old and already felt old. By day, she was a seamstress in a garment factory, one of dozens of women hunched over whirring machines in a brick building that always smelled of hot metal, oil, and sweat. The foreman barked orders. The windows were nailed shut against the cold. Thread dust floated in the air, coating tongues and lungs like a fine grit. 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. For pennies. Her fingers were always pricked and sore. Her back ached. At night, she would go home to a narrow room she rented on the top floor of a boarding house, light a single candle, and stitch until her eyes burned. Repair work for neighbors, little alterations, anything to add a few coins to the week's pay. Her parents were gone. Her father taken by pneumonia when she was 16, her mother worn down by grief and illness a few years later. There were no brothers, no sisters. No one to share the burden. The city was full of people, but for Martha, it might as well have been empty. In Boston, women of 24 were already being called old maids, if they had no husband, no home of their own, no children. For Martha, marriage wasn't just about romance. It was survival. But the men who came calling, if they came at all, were rarely better off than she was. Dock workers, laborers, men with quick tempers and quicker fists. Some smelled of drink, some of desperation. None of them offered escape. Only a different kind of cage. So Martha sewed. And endured. And tried not to think too far ahead. One evening, in the boarding house parlor, she sat beside the coal stove, her hands idle for once. The landlady, Mrs. O'Rourke, had left a week-old newspaper on the small table nearby, one from far out west, sent by a nephew who worked on the railroads. Martha flipped through it more out of habit than interest. Cattle prices. Land sales. Notices about small towns with names she'd never heard spoken aloud. And then she saw it. A small advertisement, tucked between notices about seed orders and wagon repairs. Wealthy rancher seeks bride. Good home. Steady income. Kind heart. Strong faith. Write with particulars and send photograph. Box 17, Miles City, Montana Territory. She stared at the words. A wealthy rancher. A good home. She'd heard of such things, of course. Mail order brides, they were called. Women from the east sending letters and photographs to men out west. Farmers, ranchers, miners, men who had land and money but no wives. No women at all in some towns. The idea had always sounded half like a fairy tale, half like a cautionary tale. But that night the words took root. Martha read the advertisement again and again until she could see it with her eyes closed. Wealthy rancher. Good home. Kind heart. 4 days she carried the newspaper clipping folded in her apron pocket. When the foreman shouted, when the needles broke, when the cold wind cut through the thin walls of the factory, she would press her fingers against that little square of paper and imagine something else. A house with a porch. A quiet kitchen. Sunlight on open fields. A life that belonged to her. After a week, she borrowed paper and ink from her landlady and sat at the small desk by the window. Snow drifted outside, soft and silent. Inside, the city's noise was muted, like the world was holding its breath. Her hand trembled as she began to write. She told the truth mostly. Her name. Her age. Her work as a seamstress. That she could cook and keep a house. That she was willing to work and to learn. She did not mention how often she went to bed hungry, or how some nights she woke up with tears on her face and no memory of the dream that caused them. At the end she hesitated, then added one more line. I am not a beautiful woman, but I am a faithful one. She enclosed a photograph, a small, stiff card taken at a cheap studio the year before. In it, she stood stiffly with her hair pinned back, her eyes serious, her best dress buttoned up to her throat. 3 days later, the letter was on its way west. Weeks passed. Winter in Boston was unforgiving. Coal was expensive. Food was thin. Martha told herself she had been foolish. That men who could offer such things would never choose a plain seamstress from Boston when they could have someone younger, richer, prettier. Then one gray morning the landlady called up the stairs. Miss Callahan. Letter for you. Martha's heart leapt. She almost slipped on the narrow steps in her haste. The envelope was thick, the handwriting unfamiliar. The postmark read, Miles City, MT. Her fingers shook as she broke the seal. Inside was a careful, measured hand. "Dear Miss Callahan, my name is John Caldwell. I am 39 years of age and own a ranch 10 miles outside Miles City, Montana Territory. I received your letter and your photograph and was moved by your honesty. Life is different here than in your city. The winters are hard, the land is wide, and neighbors are few. But I can offer what you seek: a home, security, and, I pray, a partnership built on mutual respect. I have a white farmhouse with a view of rolling hills and cattle enough to keep us comfortable. I am not a man of great romance, but I am steady, and I value kindness above all. If you should choose to come west, I will send the money for your ticket. We can be married upon your arrival in the church in town. Until then, I remain, yours in hope, John Caldwell." A farmhouse, rolling hills, cattle. The words glowed on the page. Over the next 6 months, letters passed back and forth like the turning of seasons. Martha told him small pieces of her life. The factory, the boarding house, her parents gone too soon, her fear of growing old alone, her secret dream of seeing open land, of waking to something other than the clatter of carts and the shout of vendors. John wrote of the ranch. He described the Montana sky, so wide it made a person feel both small and infinite. He wrote of early mornings with frost on the grass, of the sound of cattle lowing in the distance, of a white farmhouse set on a rise, its porch facing the sunrise. He wrote of wanting a wife to share it with, someone who would sit with him on that porch and listen to the wind. His letters were simple, but there was a tenderness in them, a care in the way he answered her questions. When she wrote that she feared she would be too much of a burden, he replied, "You are not a burden. You would be a blessing." The letters became the brightest part of her weeks. She would hurry home from the factory, fingers still aching, heart racing as she checked the parlor table for his careful handwriting. Slowly, the idea that had once seemed impossible began to feel like a plan. In early spring, another envelope arrived, heavier than the others. Inside was a folded document and several crisp bank notes. A train ticket. Boston to Chicago. Chicago to Miles City, Montana Territory. A single line at the bottom of his letter read, "Come, Martha. Let us build a life together." She spread the ticket on her small table and stared at it, the room suddenly too quiet. To go west meant to leave everything she knew. It meant signing her life over to a man she had never seen, whose voice she had never heard. It meant trusting ink and paper. But what did she have if she stayed? A life measured in stitches and smoke. A slow fading into nothing in a city that never knew her name. She packed her life into a single trunk. 2 dresses, a shawl, a Bible, her sewing kit, her mother's locket, the photograph of her parents on their wedding day, and the small bundle of letters tied with a string. 3 weeks later, she stood on the platform at Boston's train station, wind tugging at her coat, the whistle of the locomotive shrill in her ears. As the train pulled away and the city slid out of sight, Martha pressed her hand to the glass and whispered a quiet goodbye, to the factory, to the narrow streets, to the version of herself that had never had the courage to leave. The journey west took nearly 3 weeks. In the beginning, the landscape outside the window was familiar: towns and mills, forests cut by rivers, fields edged with stone walls. Then slowly it changed. Towns grew sparser. The trees thinned and then opened into plains that seemed to go on forever. In the cramped sleeper car, Martha met other travelers. A young couple with a baby wrapped tight against the cold. A widower headed to join his brother on a homestead claim. A quiet woman from Ohio, also traveling west to marry a man she had never met. At night, when the train rocked and the lamplight flickered, the woman from Ohio, Sarah, would talk in a low voice. "He says he's a farmer," Sarah said, folding and unfolding the letter in her hands. "Good land. Needs a wife. I tell myself it will be better than staying with my sister and her 5 children. Are you afraid?" Martha asked. Sarah gave a small, brittle laugh. "Of course. Aren't you?" Martha looked out the window at the dark prairie, at the faint outline of distant hills. "Yes," she said. "But I'm more afraid of going back." They fell silent then, 2 women suspended between the lives they knew and the ones they'd been promised. Days blurred together. The train stopped in towns that barely seemed like towns at all, just a water tower, a few shacks, a sign with a name. The air grew drier. The sky grew larger. By the time they crossed into the Montana Territory, the world outside looked almost empty. But there was a strange kind of beauty in it too, the way the light changed over the plains, the way the horizon curved gently, the way the stars at night were so bright they seemed almost close enough to touch. Martha clung to the image John had described so carefully: the white farmhouse, the rolling hills, cattle like dark coins scattered across the land. Each mile brought her closer to that promise. Each mile also brought her closer to a man she did not truly know. On a cold, bright afternoon, the conductor's shout echoed down the train. Miles City? Next stop Miles City? Martha gathered her things with trembling hands. She smoothed her dress, pinned her hair, checked the locket at her throat. In the dirty reflection of the train window, she barely recognized the woman looking back, pale, tired, but with eyes that held a flicker of something like hope. The train slowed, then shuddered to a stop. Miles City Station was small, just a wooden platform, a squat building with a potbelly stove inside, a few wagons waiting in the dirt. The air was sharper, thinner, carrying the scent of wood smoke and something raw and wild. Martha stepped down onto the platform, her trunk thumping behind her as a porter helped. She looked around, heart pounding. In his letters John had written, "I will be there to meet you. I will wear my best coat. You will know me by the white hat I will tip when I see you." At the far end of the platform, a man stood apart from the others. He was taller than she expected, shoulders broad beneath a worn brown coat. His hair was more gray than dark, his beard untrimmed, his boots scuffed. His hat was not white, but a stained, sweat-darkened brown. His face was lined not just with age but with something harder, disappointment, maybe, or contempt. His eyes, when they found hers, were cold, assessing. He didn't smile. He simply watched her, head tilted slightly, as if measuring a piece of livestock at market. Martha's heart sank. This was not the man she had pictured. Not the careful, soft-spoken rancher who wrote about the sunrise and the sound of the wind. But then he stepped forward, hand extended. Martha Callahan? His voice was rougher than she'd imagined, with a rasp of tobacco and whiskey. "Yes," she said, swallowing. "Are you Mr. Caldwell?" He nodded. "John will do." He took in her dress, her trunk, the thinness of her shoulders. "You're smaller than you looked in the photograph," he said, the words flat, almost accusing. I suppose photographs can be deceiving," she managed, forcing a small smile. He grunted. "That they can. No flowers. No welcome embrace. No gentle words after a journey of 2,000 miles. Just that cold appraisal." But where could she go if she turned away? Back to Boston with no money, no job, no room, no family? The ticket had been one way in more ways than one. She straightened her back and tried to steady her voice. "It is kind of you to meet me," she said. "The journey was long." "We best get moving," he replied. "Weather's turning. Got a wagon waiting." He lifted her trunk as if it weighed nothing and carried it toward a waiting wagon. Old, its paint peeling, the horse hitched to it as lean and tired-looking as Martha felt. As the station and the town fell behind them, the last thin threads that tied her to the world she knew snapped one by one. Ahead lay only the land. And John Caldwell. The road out of town was little more than a pair of ruts worn into the earth, bordered by low brown grass and patches of snow. The wagon creaked, wheels complaining at each stone. The horse snorted clouds of breath into the cold air. They rode in silence at first. Martha watched the line of the horizon, trying to imagine where the white farmhouse would appear, where the hills would roll, where the cattle would dot the landscape like he had described. Instead, as mile after mile passed, the land remained empty. No fences. No distant lowing of cattle. No glint of paint in the sun. She stole glances at John. Up close he looked older than his claimed 39. His hands were large, knuckles scarred, nails cracked and dark with old dirt. There was a tightness around his mouth, as if the simple act of speaking cost him something. Finally she tried. "Your letters," she began carefully, "they painted such a picture. The farmhouse, the hills. It sounds very beautiful." He shifted the reins in his hands. "It's a hard country," he said. "You'll find out soon enough." "But the cattle?" "Sold most of 'em last spring," he cut in. "Times are lean. Neighbors too close. Land's not what it used to be." His jaw clenched. "Words don't always match the truth. You'll learn that." Cold wind slipped down the back of Martha's neck. She clutched her shawl tighter. Words don't always match the truth. She thought of each letter, each careful description. Had they all been lies? Or truths that had withered in the harsh light of reality? As the sun dipped lower, turning the sky a bruised purple, a shape finally appeared on the horizon. Not a white farmhouse. A cabin. Small. Squat. The wood was dark with age and weather, boards warped and uneven. The roof sagged slightly in the middle. One shutter hung crooked. The yard was a tangle of weeds and frozen mud. No fence. No barn in sight worthy of the name. No sign of cattle. Only a leaning shed and a little ways off, a patch of earth that looked disturbed, as if it had been dug and filled again and again. The wagon rolled to a stop. John climbed down without a word and lifted her trunk to the ground. Then he turned to her, expression unreadable. "Home," he said. The word landed like a stone in her stomach. Martha stepped down, her boots sinking slightly into the cold, soft earth. The cabin loomed ahead, its single window dark, like an eye that refused to blink. Her mind skittered wildly, trying to reconcile what she saw with what she had been promised. I must admit," she said quietly, "I had expected more," he finished for her, eyes hard. "Most do." He walked toward the cabin, leaving her standing there with the wind cutting through her dress. No gentle hand on her elbow. No offer to show her inside first. No warmth at all. She took a breath, tasted dust and old smoke and followed. Inside the cabin was worse. The air was stale, tinged with the sharp, sour scent of old whiskey and unwashed clothes. A rough table stood near the center, one leg propped up with a wedge of scrap wood. 2 chairs. A narrow bed in the corner with a stained blanket thrown over it. A small stove, its metal sides dented and blackened. A single shelf with a few mismatched plates and cups. In the half-light that filtered through the grimy window, she could see mouse droppings in the corners, a trail of mud across the floor, something dark and sticky on the table that had never been wiped. No lace curtains. No rocking chair by the window. No bookshelf with carefully chosen volumes as he had once described in a letter. She set her gloved hand on the edge of the table to steady herself and pulled it back almost immediately, fingertips coming away tacky. John watched her, something like amusement flickering in his eyes. "Not what you pictured," he said. "No," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Well, you ain't what I pictured either. But here we are." Her cheeks burned. "You wrote of a farmhouse, Mr. Caldwell? Of cattle. I wrote what I needed to write," he said, his tone turning sharp. "Men don't get wives out here telling them everything's rot and ruin. You think any women would come if they knew the truth?" He stepped closer, his shadow falling over her. "You came for a home. I gave you one. Might not be the one in your dreams, but it's 4 walls and a roof. That's more than many have." Her heart hammered in her chest. "You lied," she said, the words escaping before she could stop them. He shrugged. "You're here, ain't you?" Their eyes met then. For the first time, Martha saw something beneath the coldness. Not regret. Possession. In that moment, she understood something very clearly. Whatever promises had been made on paper had dissolved at the cabin door. Whatever protection she thought marriage might bring would be on his terms, not hers. Outside, the wind rose, rattling the single window. Inside, a silence fell between them that felt heavy, like thunder waiting to break. They were married the next day. Not in the white church in town he had described, filled with neighbors and a kindly pastor. There was no white dress, no flowers, no warm congratulations. Instead, a circuit preacher passing through rode up to the cabin, his horse steaming in the cold air. The man's coat was threadbare, his Bible worn, his eyes tired but kind. He stood with them in the hard-packed dirt outside the cabin while the wind snapped at their clothes. "Do you, John Caldwell, take this woman?" "I do," John said, eyes fixed on Martha, his hand gripping hers just a little too tightly. "Do you, Martha Callahan, take this man?" Her throat felt dry. The words of every letter, every promise, spun through her mind like scraps of cloth in a storm. "I do," she whispered. The preacher said the final words, his breath turning to clouds in the cold air. "That's it then," he said gently, giving Martha a brief, sympathetic look, as if he could see more than she said. "You're man and wife." John pressed a few coins into the preacher's hand and nodded toward the horizon. "Best ride before dark," he said. The preacher hesitated, then tipped his hat to Martha. "God go with you, Mrs. Caldwell." Mrs. Caldwell. The name settled on her shoulders like a cloak that didn't fit quite right. She watched the preacher ride away, the tiny figure of horse and man shrinking against the vast emptiness. When they disappeared over the slight rise, she felt more alone than she had ever felt in all the crowded streets of Boston. Behind her, the cabin door creaked open. "Come inside," John said. His tone made it clear it was not a suggestion. That afternoon he showed her where he kept the flour, the salt, the coffee. Where the well was. How to stack the wood by the stove. "You'll be doing the cooking, the cleaning, the tending," he said. "I don't have time for nursing some delicate city girl. You're here to be useful." He did not ask about her journey. He did not ask if she was tired or hungry or afraid. He treated her not as a guest, not as a partner, but as a new tool he had acquired. Still Martha tried. She scrubbed the table. She swept the floor until her arms ached. She boiled water and cleaned what dishes there were. The cabin began to smell less of stale whiskey and more of soap and wood smoke. As evening fell, she made a simple meal, biscuits and beans and coffee, her movements efficient, automatic. Cooking for one more person was not hard. The hard thing was pretending she wasn't terrified. They ate mostly in silence. Once she tried to ask, "Will I meet your neighbors? Or go into town?" "Neighbors keep to themselves," he said. "They don't need to know my business and you don't need to know theirs. Town's a day's ride. You'll go if there's need. Until then you stay here." As she washed the dishes, her gaze drifted to a door she hadn't noticed before, set low in the floor near the corner of the cabin. A trapdoor, its edges dark with wear. "What's down there?" she asked, forcing her voice to remain casual. "Root cellar," he replied without looking up. "Where I keep what matters." His tone made it clear the subject was closed. That night, the reality of her situation settled over her like the weight of a mountain. She had come so far. There was no easy way back. The wilderness outside did not care if she lived or died. The nearest town was miles away across open land she did not know. She had no horse, no money, no friends. And within these four walls she had only him. On their wedding night the cabin seemed smaller, the air heavier. The bed in the corner loomed like a dark, waiting thing. Martha folded her dress carefully and laid it over the back of a chair, fingers numb. She kept her chemise on, the thin cotton offering little comfort but at least a veil between her and the world. John sat on the edge of the bed, watching her with that same cold, assessing gaze. "You're a quiet one," he said. "Thought women from the city had more to say." I speak when there's something worth saying," she replied, her voice unsteady. He smirked. "We'll see how long that lasts." He reached for the bottle on the small table beside the bed and took a long pull. The sharp scent of whiskey filled the room, cutting through the lingering smell of soap. "You know," he said, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand, "you're not the first wife I've had from back east." Martha froze. Her heart gave a painful lurch. "I thought," she swallowed. "In your letters you said you'd never been married." "I said a lot of things in those letters," he said. "Doesn't mean they were all true." He laughed then, a low, humorless sound that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. "How many?" she asked, her voice barely audible. He tilted his head, considering. "3, he said finally. "Before you." The room seemed to tilt. Martha gripped the back of the chair to steady herself. "3, she repeated, her breath coming faster. What happened to them?" His eyes held hers and in them she saw no grief, no regret. "They didn't last," he said. Something in his tone turned her blood cold. "Did they leave?" she whispered, though she already suspected the answer. He smiled then. A thin, cruel stretch of lips. "Not exactly." He rose from the bed and crossed the room in 3 slow steps. "You see," he said, "women who come out here, they think they know what they want. They write pretty words on paper about partnership and love and sharing burdens. But once they see what life is really like, once they realize there's no going back," he shrugged, "they start to complain, to question, to say no." He leaned in, his breath hot against her face, sour with drink. "I don't tolerate no," he said softly. Martha's heart thundered in her chest. "Where are they, John?" she asked, her voice shaking. "Those women." His gaze flicked toward the corner of the room, toward the low door in the floor. "The root cellar," he said, "keeps everything quiet, everything contained." She felt suddenly lightheaded, as if the very air had been sucked from the room. "You're lying," she whispered, though it sounded more like a plea. He chuckled, the sound slithering down her spine. "You think you're the first to see that door and ask questions?" he said. "They all did. Curiosity's a dangerous thing, Martha." Her eyes drifted to the trapdoor. The edges. The worn handle. The faint, metallic smell she had dismissed as old tools or canned goods. Her mind conjured images she did not want to see. Faces. Hands that once stitched and cooked and wrote letters home. Voices that cried out and then went silent. She pressed a shaking hand to her mouth. "Why are you telling me this?" she managed, her voice ragged. His expression changed then, something like satisfaction crossing his features, like a cat that had cornered a mouse and was now playing with it. "Because you need to understand how things are," he said. "You came here for a husband. You've got one. You're mine now. Body and soul." He reached out and gripped her chin, his fingers digging into her skin. "You don't run. You don't refuse. You don't disobey. You do what you're told and maybe," he leaned closer, his eyes flat and empty, "maybe you'll last longer than they did." Martha's breath came in short, sharp bursts. Her heart pounded so loudly she could hear it like a drum in her ears. Something inside her, something that had bent and bent under the weight of years of hardship, of factory floors and cold nights and empty promises, finally snapped. She had survived factory fires. She had survived poverty. She had survived a journey across a continent. She had not come all this way to become another secret in a root cellar. Not for him. Not for anyone. That night, as the wind howled outside and the cabin creaked in its foundations, John drank himself into a heavy sleep. He lay sprawled on the bed, one arm flung wide, the bottle tipped over beside him, dark liquid staining the rough floorboards. His snores rose and fell like the growl of some slumbering beast. Martha lay beside him at first, eyes open in the darkness, every muscle in her body tense. She listened to the sounds of the night, the wind, the soft scratching of mice in the walls, the slow, heavy breathing of the man who had just told her she was nothing more than his property. Her mind raced. She thought of the 3 women who had come before her. Women who had packed trunks with their best dresses and their highest hopes. Women who had stepped down from trains, hearts pounding with a mixture of fear and excitement, believing they were walking toward a new life. Women who now, if his words were true, lay beneath this very floor. She imagined them in the dark. Their voices silenced. Their names forgotten. She imagined herself beside them. She could feel the earth closing over her. She could smell the damp, the rot, the finality of it. No. Very carefully she slid from the bed, her feet finding the floor without a sound. She moved through the darkness by memory now, having memorized the room over the course of the day. The stove. The table. The door. And there, near the peg where he had hung his hat and coat, was the rifle. Beside it, leaning against the wall, was the long, slender hunting knife he had used to cut salt pork at supper. Its handle was worn smooth. The blade was clean. Ready. She wrapped her fingers around the knife's handle, feeling the weight of it. The coldness of the steel. For a moment she simply stood there, the knife in her hand, her heart beating so hard she thought it might wake him. She had never killed anything larger than a chicken. The idea of raising a weapon against another human being, especially the man who, in the eyes of the law and the church, was now her husband, made her stomach twist. But then she looked at the trapdoor in the floor. She remembered his words, "You're mine now, body and soul." And she understood, with a clarity that burned, that if she did nothing, if she lay back down and closed her eyes and hoped for mercy, she would not see another spring. Or if she did, it would be only as bones in the cold dark. The law was far away. Justice even further. No one was coming to save her. If her life was to be spared, she would have to spare it herself. She moved back to the bed, each step silent, her bare feet careful on the rough boards. In the faint light that seeped under the door and through the window, she could see his face, slack now with sleep. Harmless, almost. The lines of cruelty smoothed away. It would be so easy, a voice whispered. One cut. One moment. And you live. She swallowed hard, tears burning in her eyes. I'm sorry, she whispered, not to him, but perhaps to the girl she had been, to the world she had hoped for and not found. He stirred, his hand twitching slightly. She did not let herself hesitate again. In the quiet, lonely cabin on the Montana plains, the hunter became the hunted. In the gray light of morning, the land was silent. Frost clung to the grass like a thin veil. The sky was a pale, washed-out blue. The world looked almost peaceful, if you didn't look too closely. A neighbor named Samuel Griggs hitched his team and started down the narrow track that led past the Caldwell place. He had a small list of reasons in his mind, an excuse about a piece of fence that needed mending near the shared boundary, a mention of borrowed tools needing returning. The real reason was unease. He had seen the new woman's arrival in town, the way she'd stepped down from the train with hope in her eyes and a trunk in her hand. He'd watched John Caldwell's rough, impassive face as he'd taken her measure. Samuel had known men like John. Men who drank too much, laughed too little, and carried a darkness inside them that never quite surfaced until it was too late. He told himself it was none of his business. But the image of the woman, standing on the platform with the wind tugging at her dress, had stayed with him all night. As his wagon crested a small rise, the Caldwell cabin came into view. At first he thought he was imagining the figure walking along the road, a small hunched shape, the skirt of her dress dragging in the dirt, hair loose around her face. Then he saw the color. Red. Spattered down the front of her dress. Drying in streaks on her hands, her arms. Dark against the pale fabric. He pulled the horses up short, his heart thudding. "Ma'am?" he called out. "Ma'am, are you?" She raised her head slowly. Her face was ashen, her eyes vacant, staring at something that was no longer there. Blood clung to her jaw, to the side of her neck. Her footsteps were unsteady, like each one cost her. "Mrs. Caldwell?" He tried, though he knew full well they'd been married only a day. The name tasted strange in his mouth. She stopped then, swaying slightly. "He's dead," she said. Her voice was flat, distant, as if she were reciting a fact from a book rather than speaking of the man she had married less than 24 hours before. "John's dead." Samuel climbed down from the wagon, heart hammering. "Were you hurt?" he asked, eyes scanning her for obvious wounds. "What happened?" Her hands trembled at her sides. He killed them," she said, the words tumbling out. "He killed them all. The others. In the root cellar. I saw. Her breath hitched. She took a step toward him, then another. I couldn't let him." Her voice broke on the last word. Samuel took off his coat and wrapped it around her shoulders, trying to ignore the stiffness of the dried blood beneath his fingers. "Slow down," he said gently. "You're safe now. We'll get the sheriff. We'll get this sorted." Her eyes met his then, for the first time truly focusing on another living soul. "Am I?" she asked. There was no self-pity in the question. Only a deep, bone-deep exhaustion. He didn't answer. Instead, he helped her into the wagon, his mind already racing ahead to town, to the sheriff's office, to the grim duty that awaited them at the Caldwell cabin. Sheriff Thomas Burke had seen his share of ugliness in the Montana Territory. He'd broken up saloon fights that ended with teeth in the sawdust. He'd ridden out to find men shot over card games and cattle. He'd stood between angry neighbors who'd let land and pride turn into something fierce and hateful. But what he saw beneath the Caldwell cabin stayed with him for the rest of his life. The trapdoor was heavier than it looked, the wood swollen with damp. When Samuel and the sheriff pried it up, a wave of cold, stale air rolled out, carrying with it the smell of earth and something far worse. A lantern was lowered first, its light casting flickering shadows on rough walls. Then the sheriff descended the narrow ladder, each rung creaking under his weight. The packed dirt floor was clammy beneath his boots. The walls were lined not with neat shelves of preserved food as a root cellar should be, but with crude wooden boxes. Shallow graves angled into the earth. He opened the first box with hands that he forced to remain steady. Inside were bones, still clothed in the tatters of what had once been fine fabric, the kind women wore when they left everything behind, determined to put their best selves forward. In another box, a scrap of lace clung to a slender wrist bone. In another, a shoe. Each one told the same story in different fragments. Women who had come so far only to end here in the cold, forgotten and alone. 3 boxes. 3 women. So he wasn't lying, the sheriff murmured, his voice echoing dully in the confined space. 3 before her. He climbed back up into the cabin, the daylight almost blinding after the pressing darkness below. Martha sat at the table, Samuel's coat still around her shoulders, her hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee she didn't drink. Her eyes were fixed on a knot in the wood of the table, as if it were the only solid thing in a world that had come apart. "Mrs. Caldwell," the sheriff said carefully. "Martha. I need you to tell me what happened." She spoke in fits and starts at first, like an engine that couldn't quite catch. But once the story began to pour out, it did not stop. She told him about the letters. About the promised farmhouse and the cattle. About the first sight of the cabin, the lies, the threats. About the words he'd spoken on their wedding night. About the root cellar. About the knife. "I thought the law would be on his side," she said quietly. "Men like him, they always seem to have the law." She looked up then, eyes blazing for the first time, a flash of the steel that had carried her across 2,000 miles. "So I did what I had to do." The sheriff listened, his face grave. He had known John Caldwell by reputation, a hard man, a drinker, a man whose wives never seemed to last. He had never been able to prove anything. Women went missing on the frontier for all kinds of reasons. Disease, exposure. Men who didn't like to be told no. It was easy to say they'd gone back east. Easy to say they'd run off. Easier to look away. Now, faced with the bones beneath the floor and the quiet woman at the table, looking smaller and yet somehow stronger than she had when he first walked in, Sheriff Burke felt the weight of every time he'd ignored a nagging suspicion. Every time he'd told himself it wasn't his affair. He took off his hat and set it on the table. "You won't be charged," he said at last. Martha blinked. "What?" "You acted in self-defense," he said. "Any man who hears your story, who sees what's down there, will know that. The judge, the jury, the town. They'll call it what it is." "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely a breath. He met her gaze, his own eyes tired but steady. "Righteous justice," he said. Word spread quickly in town. At first, it was in whispers, passed between women at the pump, between cowhands over their midday meal, between shopkeepers as they swept their thresholds. "Did you hear about the new bride? The one from back east? They say she killed him. They say he killed 3 others before her. They say the sheriff found them under the floor." Some shook their heads and muttered about the dangers of bringing strangers into one's home, whether man or woman. Others, mostly women who had known what it was to fear the weight of a man's hand, spoke more softly. "She did what she had to," they said. "I would have done the same." When the story finally reached the small territorial courtroom, it did so stripped of some of its blood and horror, as the legal minds turned it into facts and timelines and questions of intent. But even there, beneath the dry language of the law, emotion simmered. Martha sat in the front, a plain dress borrowed from the sheriff's wife replacing the blood-soaked one. Her hair was pulled back neatly. Her hands were folded in her lap, the knuckles white. The judge, an older man with a face lined by years and a gaze that missed little, listened as the sheriff recounted what he'd found. As Samuel spoke of the sight of her on the road. As the circuit preacher spoke of the strange air about John Caldwell, even at the hasty wedding. When it was Martha's turn, she rose slowly. Her voice did not tremble this time. "I came here for a husband," she said. "I came for a home. For safety. For a chance to live a life that was more than sewing in a factory until I died." She told it all again, in the plain, unadorned words of someone who had nothing left to lose. "I believed his letters," she said. "I believed his promises. But the man who met me at that train was not the man who wrote those words. He lied about the house, the land, the cattle. He lied about his past. He lied about everything. Except one thing." She paused, the room holding its breath. "He told the truth when he said the root cellar held the others," she finished. "He told the truth when he said I wouldn't leave. Not alive." Silence settled over the room like a heavy blanket. The judge leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "I have served this territory for a long time," he said finally. "I have seen men do terrible things and claim them as their right. I have seen women blamed for the sins of the men who hurt them. The frontier is a hard place. But hardship is not a license for cruelty." He looked at Martha. "You faced a monster alone," he said quietly. "No neighbors near enough to hear you scream. No lawman close enough to ride to your aid. You did what you believed you must to survive." He picked up his gavel, weighed it in his hand, then set it down gently. "This court will not punish you for saving your own life," he said. "There will be no trial. No charges. Let the record show that John Caldwell met a just end at the hand of the only person he left alive to tell the tale." His eyes swept the room, daring anyone to disagree. "Some might call it murder," he added. "I call it righteous justice." A murmur rippled through the room, some shocked, some approving, some simply relieved. Martha swayed slightly, the weight of the words hitting her. Free. The word didn't feel real. Not yet. But it was a beginning. In a territory that rarely remembered the names of the dead, let alone the women who passed through, Martha Callahan's story might easily have been forgotten too. She could have been a footnote in a dusty court ledger. A cautionary tale told over whiskey and poker. A rumor. Instead, she did something perhaps more remarkable than what she had done in that cabin. She stayed. She did not take the first eastbound train back to Boston, though the sheriff quietly offered her the money to do so. She did not vanish into the anonymity of another city, another factory floor. She chose to make a life in the very place where she had nearly died. For a while she lived in town, taking in mending and sewing for the families there. Her hands, which had once stitched until they bled for pennies, now brought in enough to keep a small rented room and food on the table. It was not comfort exactly, but it was hers. People stared at first. Some with pity. Some with awe. Some with that particular blend of curiosity and fear reserved for those who have walked close to the edge and come back changed. But time, even in a harsh place, has a way of wearing down sharp edges. The women came first. They would pause a little longer at her doorway. Bring small things to be repaired, a torn hem, a ripped cuff, just to have an excuse to sit at her table and talk. They asked her, in careful, roundabout ways, about Boston. About trains. About what it was like to make such a journey alone. About fear. Sometimes they asked about John. Mostly she did not answer that last part. Not in words. But when she spoke about the choices women were forced to make, between hunger and marriage, between an unknown life and a known misery, there was a steel in her voice that had not been there before. 2 years passed. The Montana Territory shifted and grew around her. New faces arrived. Old ones moved on. The winds rose and fell. The seasons turned. And then one day, a man walked into the small schoolhouse where she had been helping patch children's coats. His name was Daniel Harper. A schoolteacher from back east like her. He had come west not for land, not for gold, but for the quiet promise of a classroom in a place that needed one. He was not tall. Not particularly handsome. His hands were ink-stained, his spectacles always a little crooked on his nose. But his eyes were kind. And when he looked at Martha, he did not see a ghost story or a scandal or a curiosity. He saw a woman who had endured. Over time their conversations, at first about books and children and the strange beauty of the Montana sky, deepened into something else. He did not press her for details about her past. He did not flinch when, on a winter evening, she told him in halting words about a cabin, and a trapdoor and a hunting knife. He listened. He believed her. And then he did something that startled her more than anything. He did not ask her to marry him to save her. He asked her to marry him because he loved her. They wed quietly, in the small church in town that John Caldwell had once promised her but never delivered. No grand speeches. No fancy dress. Just a handful of neighbors who had watched her transform from a frightened stranger on the road to a woman they trusted. Over the years Martha had 4 children. 3 sons and a daughter. She filled her house with the kinds of things she had once only dared to imagine. The smell of bread in the oven, the sound of laughter at the table, the sight of books stacked untidily on every available surface. She taught her daughter how to read, how to sew, how to say no and mean it. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, when the younger children were asleep and the older ones pretended not to be listening, she would tell them stories of Boston, of trains, of how far a person could go with nothing but hope and a one-way ticket. She never told them in detail about that first night in the cabin. She never spoke of the root cellar, of the bones, of the woman she had been when she stood with a knife in her hand and decided to live. But sometimes, when the wind howled outside just so, when the lamplight flickered against the walls, Daniel would glance at her across the room. She would meet his eyes and know that he remembered, that he understood the cost of their peace. And they would sit together in the quiet, grateful for the simple miracle of being there at all. Out on the plains, cabins rot. Fences fall. Names fade. The Caldwell place in time collapsed in on itself. The wood warped, the roof sagged, the walls bowed. The land swallowed what it could as it always does. But if you stood in the right place on a still evening, you might hear more than just the wind in the grass. You might hear the memory of a young woman stepping down from a train, her heart full of fragile hope. You might hear the echo of a door creaking open, of lies spoken in a low, rough voice. You might hear, faintly, the whisper of a knife being drawn from its sheath. And if you listened even closer, you might hear something else. The steady, stubborn heartbeat of a woman who refused to be buried, no matter how deep the root cellar was, no matter how dark the night. Because in the end, this is not only a story about a monster in a cabin on the Montana plains. It is a story about the women who were sent to that frontier as if they were packages to be claimed. About the risks they took when they traded everything they knew for the promise of a better life. About the dangers that waited for them in the spaces between what men wrote and who they truly were. Most of all, it is a story about survival. Martha Callahan traveled 2,000 miles to find love. On her wedding night, she found a monster instead. He thought he was the hunter. He thought she was just another frightened bride, another name to be buried beneath the floor. He was wrong. Sometimes, when the night is darkest and all hope seems gone, the prey remembers it has teeth. Sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one who will not go silently into the ground. Sometimes the hunter becomes the hunted. If this story pulled you into the darker side of the Wild West, don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next tale from the frontier. Now I want to hear from you. Do you think Martha was justified in what she did that night, given the world she was trapped in? And what do you believe you would have done in her place? Let me know in the comments and share this video with someone who loves true frontier stories as much as you do.